life,
kindness,
people and places,
sincerity,
love,
integrity,
the incredible universe. You're listening to the Living Out Loud podcast with Natasha Moy and Dr. Vincent, where we talk about life, love, and the universe. You're listening to the Living Out Loud podcast with Natasha Moy and Dr. Vincent, where we talk about life, love, and the universe. Today, we're going to be interviewing Liz Gall, who is somebody's child, as we all are, but this is a very specific name to her. And we're going to be talking about drugs, drug addiction, and a lot around recovery and what that is actually like, that journey to recovery. The drug journey is very close to my own heart, and so I'm very interested in interviewing you. So welcome, Liz.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And my gorgeous Dr. Vinny. Do you think I can start calling you Dr. Vinny? Do we know each other well enough but I'm going to call you Dr. Vincent because I can just see you arcing up at that Vinny thing.
I know.
So we are once again at this point where we start asking some hard questions around some interesting topics. We've tackled some really thoughtful things in the last couple of episodes. We've spoken about bullying. We've spoken about death. We've spoken about teenage trauma, passion, truth and lies, which is coming at some point, and also financial therapy, which has been quite interesting, and also renovating for success, which is very popular. So today we're going to talk about something that I think has touched everyone to some degree, and that is drug addiction and recovery and the process for that. Although a lot of people don't get to recovery, Liz, do they?
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, most people that I know that I used with are still out there using, or they've died. So it is a very small number of people who actually get through drug dependence to lead a better quality of life.
You started taking drugs when you were 13 years of age, which is very young. That would be year 7 or 8.
Year 8,
Year 8. You're at an extremely vulnerable phase at that point, and particularly as a girl, you're in that bullying environment. You're in that, everyone needs to have what everyone has. It's the way you look, the way you feel, and you were not happy at home, from what I can understand.
Yeah, so I spent a large part of my teenage years not while I was at home. I left home at 15, but not getting along with my mother. My parents got divorced when I was 7, and I think I blamed her for a lot of that. And there were things about my childhood that, that I didn't like. And my mother was a single mother with 4 kids, and she did the best that she could, and I look back now and I can see that she did an amazing job. But at the time, I was a teenage girl who was not happy. I spent most of my life feeling like I wasn't enough and like I wasn't part of. So it was very much when I started using drugs, I was pushing that stuff down, and I didn't know that at the time. But, from the, trying the alcohol for the first few times and smoking my first few cones, it gave me something to take me away and to disconnect me from myself at that time.
So I have an interesting, connection to drugs, being that I'm not particularly good at taking them. So fortunately, I don't have that personality that kind of leans on that. But also I think I have massive fear. So, I'm terrified that if I ever did an ecstasy tablet, I would be the one person who got the one that killed you. Mm-hmm. So those kind of things, I suppose that mortality thing. But we have quite a significant amount of drug addiction in our family. Quite close to me and my siblings, and also almost in every one of our sort of family pods, one of the children actually landed up becoming a drug addict or a schizophrenic through drug addiction, or so quite a lot. And we also have an enormous amount of depression and anxiety in our family. And I'm wondering if that's not something maybe you were experiencing as a young girl, that those feelings were of sadness and of but undiagnosed, and then you go and look to self-medicate.
100%, that's what I believe. I believe that people who become drug dependent are medicating something, whether it's anxiety or depression or trauma. I believe that they are medicating something. There's research around early childhood attachment. So the first 0 to 5 years or 0 to 7 years, and that early attachment that you get in childhood, looking at your connection with people and the important people in your life and getting your needs met is, sorry, I've just gone completely blank.
No, that's okay. We're talking, I'm probably pressing you a bit already, and that is around the sort of the depression angle. You know, people who use, from my understanding, a lot of that is a salve for feelings of depression and anxiety, where as a teenager, you're maybe not in a position to identify that that's what's actually wrong.
Yeah, and I didn't know that I was trying to medicate at the time. It wasn't until years later when I stopped using drugs that I went, oh, okay, I've been doing this for so long to push things down. You know, when I started using it, was that, I don't even want to say peer pressure. It was just, that was going on, you know, people weren't sitting there trying to force me to use drugs. That was what was happening around me. And you kind of, you know, you gravitate towards the things that were happening around you. So I had my friends that didn't use drugs, and I had my friends who did use drugs. So when I was with them, I did that stuff. And as I began to use them, I began to become really comfortable with that, because they kind of, I felt not okay inside. Like internally, I felt not okay with myself. And so when I
was it an
used
escape?
drugs, sorry, it was an escape. And I read a lot of books as well. I liked to read books because it got me out of my world and into another world. So it was all about escapism and medicating and pushing away the pain and the shame and a whole bunch of other things that goes on with, you know, teenagers and people growing, I mean, I guess adults as well.
I've been told this before, that a lot of people use drug. Like I've never touched or tried or taken drug in my life before. But I've heard that people say to me that a lot of people have tried drugs. However, not all of them become addicted to drugs. And through your experience, through your own circumstances, and looking around at your friends who use drug, what do you think causes addiction? Is that more the anxiety, depression, hardship sort of kind of factor, or is it like a recreational factor?
I think there's a few different elements to it. And as you said, like most looks, I think the studies show that 40-something percent of people in this country have admitted to using drugs at one point or another in their life. There's also probably a whole bunch more who haven't admitted it. And most of those people don't become addicted. And I think there are many different elements to it. There's that like kind of nature versus nurture argument. And for me, I just think it's a mixture of both things. You know, when you look at, you know, some people who come from families where there is a lot of drug dependence don't become drug dependent, you know, whereas all signs would point to, okay, they're going to be drug dependent because both of their parents are and their brothers and their sisters are. But maybe, you know, that scared them off it. For myself, I didn't, there's alcohol dependence in my family. To my knowledge, I'm the only person who has become dependent on drugs. Most of the people who I used drugs with when I was younger did not become dependent on drugs. And so I think there's that, like I spoke about before, that early attachment stuff, you know, getting enough love and connection as a young child. There is that stuff around mental health stuff and medicating, and nature versus nurture, you know, so, and I guess that's everything that I've spoken to.
You know, it's interesting. My dad is an alcoholic and suffered from extreme depression. You know, grew up, raised very, very, very poor in the middle of nowhere, outback Australia, and I think couldn't deal with any of his emotions, and you know, became an alcoholic. My one brother has had massive issues around drugs and lots of problems with that. And it's fascinating to watch how we were all raised the same way, and we had a very traumatic upbringing, all of us, extremely traumatic, extreme violence, extreme everything, and yet how we've all sort of survived very differently. And I also think that drugs, you know, if you can't form a habit, you can't become a drug a drug addict, because I can't form a habit. I can't go and do things over and over and over again. I've got the ability to do that. And whereas I think people who can form habit and can, they become very process driven around that. They keep going back to the same thing that kind of fixes it. Whereas, so I think it's also a personality thing. You can either create that habit. Do you have habits now so are you habit orientated? You would be, wouldn't you know?
In some ways, I'm like all over the shop. I've got a very unstructured life, but then I spend a lot of time on Facebook. Okay. Facebook is one of my habits, but I'm not. Look, there's Facebook, and I get kind of addicted to a TV series every now and then. But something with drug use as well is the longer that you can put off a person using drugs, the less chance that they will become dependent. So at 13 years old, when I started using drugs, my brain was forming. A lot of those neural pathways were firing off, and you start using drugs and it fires up this, that makes me feel good. And then it fires up this, that makes me feel this. And my brain learned to need those things to be able to get that result.
So you're saying almost that certain age group is more vulnerable. People in a certain age group are more vulnerable towards developing the addiction. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, from my understanding, the research that I've heard from other people, that's correct. As your brain is still forming, it is much easier to become addicted. So someone who starts using drugs at 13 compared to someone who starts using drugs at 21, there will be more chance that the 13-year-old who starts using drugs on a regular social basis will become addicted to someone who starts using drugs at 21 on a, kind of regular social basis.
The interesting thing about sort of drug users and drug abuse, I mean, my understanding is that, and this is what we get told, is, you try ice once and you're going to be an ice addict. It isn't true, is it?
Not at all. Most people who try ice will go, okay, I'm never using that again.
Right. Okay. What does it make you feel? What do you feel? Because you've taken everything, haven't you? I mean, you've literally taken
much.
Yeah, actually, that's another question that before we move forward, I like if you're comfortable in sharing, like because from my understanding, reading your articles and biography and everything, I don't know whether this is the right way to say or not, but it's almost at their level of addiction, and you are pretty up there.
I would say you're at the top of the addiction tree. I mean, you are shooting heroin almost every day, literally
every day in gutters.
Can you describe a little bit more in that darkest hour, like why is it so bad? What did you do and what did you take?
Yeah. So I started as most people do. I started at, most people don't start at 13 years old, but I started at 13 years old with smoking pot and drinking alcohol. And I'm not here to say they're gateway drugs, because it doesn't matter what I'd started with. I believe that I always would have become dependent just because I had that thing in me that I needed to medicate, or that I felt that I needed to medicate. So I started with that. And, by 15, I left home. And I was hanging around older people who were shooting up ice and shooting up speed and shooting up heroin. And I had my first shot at 16 years old, with a group of friends. And when I had that, I said, I want to try it this way because, everyone else is doing it this way and they're getting more of an effect from it. So I'll try it this way once and then I'll never do it this way again. I just want to know why you guys are all doing it this way. And so I had someone inject me, and from that very first time, if I could inject, I never did it any other way, because the feeling, and that first drug that I injected was actually speed, and that feeling, that euphoria and that confidence and that kind of my brain going a million miles an hour and me being able to speak and have conversations that may not have made any sense, but at the time it gave me more confidence. I wasn't someone who was a very confident person. Like I'm sitting here talking today, this has not been my natural state for most of my life. This is something that I've learned to do in recovery. So it gave me something that I didn't feel that I had. And, it started off as social use, and it very quickly deteriorated. I was couch surfing in boarding house rooms on Flinders Street in Darlinhurst at this time, and these boarding house rooms were filled with German cockroaches. And they were not, a place where a 16-year-old girl or anyone should be living. But that was where I was at already. So I'm at 16 years old.
You're 16 years of age, you're shooting up, you're living in the coast, you've got no family around you. It's not, the percentage of women to men who use seems to be diminished. It seems to be less women using than men, and certainly less women on the street. Or is that just a perception of mine?
I'm not 100% sure on the statistics of that. I can't answer that question.
Did you find there were more men around you?
I definitely used with a lot more men, but that may also have had something to do with the fact that I was a young woman, young girl on the streets. And
were you trading sex for the drugs?
I did. I started sex work at 17 years old. And sex work, I have no issue with that at all, but it wasn't something that I ever planned to be doing. I always said like I was going to be a school teacher. I wasn't going to be a sex worker. And and there's safe ways of doing sex work and there's esteeming ways of doing sex work. And what I was doing was really unsafe. I was getting into cars with strangers and I was doing jobs for really small amounts of money. I was not valuing myself. My clients were not valuing me, and I was putting myself at constant risk. So it wasn't.
Sorry, so I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
Because the reason why something just popped in my head was because you were talking about how you it's almost like you have this hole that you need to fill in with drugs because you don't necessarily feel probably as a blanket statement comfortable with yourself. But then when you started trading sex for drugs or trading sex for money to buy drugs, then you started talking about you're doing the work for a very minimal amount of money and you're not failing yourself, your client was not failing yourself. So it's a vicious circle, isn't it?
And this is the thing, I started off quite young and I had this stuff that I needed to medicate. And then as time went on, the stuff that I needed to medicate was the things that I was doing or the things that were happening to me in relation to my drug dependence. So I started off with this little amount of trauma, and by the time I got to rehab at 26 years old, I sat there and told a therapist, oh no, I've had no trauma. And then in this interview that I had to do to get to stage 2 of a program, I had to spend it took 2 hours to sit there and go through my life story. And she said to me, well, this is trauma and this is trauma and this is trauma and this is trauma. And I just thought, oh, well, I got through it all. I didn't kind of stop to think, okay, I've survived because I used drugs to push all of that stuff down, and at the end of my use, there was so much guilt and shame and pain. I had a child that I could no longer look after. And there was just so much stuff around that the drugs didn't work anymore. I was on methadone. I was taking, Xanax and using extreme amounts of cocaine, and I was uppers and downers and all over the place, and the drugs didn't work anymore. They couldn't cover up the trauma and the feelings inside me around all of the things that I had done.
You had a child, and it's interesting as a mother. I think about what I would do for my child, and I would literally stop a bus. I would fight with everything. Mother lion, and I know that that's how you feel currently about your daughter, and potentially about the son that you have, who's now a teen, a big teen. But at the time, the drug was so strong that it actually overwhelmed your parental, your mother instinct. For me, as a mum and someone who doesn't take drugs, it's very hard to understand how something could be that much of a force that you literally, but it kind of takes away all of your natural ability, doesn't it? So it diminishes your ability to think and reason, and you just become sort of almost animalistic in your drive to find it.
Yeah, 100%. And
terrible, isn't it? Heartbreaking.
I don't believe that anyone who hasn't gone through it could ever understand. No matter how much I explain it, I don't believe that anyone could ever understand. But there is for me, you know, I had my son, I was 19 years old when I got pregnant, and I wasn't using heroin every single day, but I was using something every single day. So I wasn't physically dependent on a particular substance, you know, and when I went to hospital, I had been using every single day for, you know, since I was 15 years old. 20 years old when my son was born, and I was in hospital for 6 days, and I didn't use for that 6 days. I was in hospital and I had this little baby boy, and I remember him being born, and I remember the love, and I remember the connection that just flooded through me instantaneously. As soon as he was born, there was this love and this connection, and I'd never experienced anything like it. And 6 days later, I left that hospital, and I went home with his violent father to a house where everyone drank and a lot of people smoked pot. And on the way home, I stopped at Cash Stop, which is like a payday advance pay place. And I got money out, and you know, the next day I had a needle in my arm, because I left this hospital thinking this is my baby and I'm going to love him forever and I'm going to do it, you know, I'm just going to be a mum. And I left hospital and nobody had put anything in place for me. They knew that I was a drug user. They did a brain scan on my son, because I'd used ice during my pregnancy before I knew I was pregnant, to check if he was okay. But I was never offered any support around my parenting. It was never kind of suggested to me, hey, why don't you get some support around this stuff? You know, I was in a violent relationship. I was a young mother. I was a first-time mother, and I was drug dependent. And nobody ever said to me, hey, we want to support you. What can we do, or what do you need? And I wouldn't have known what I needed at that age. But so I left that hospital with the best of intentions, but I didn't know how to live life without using. I'd had no experience of being a responsible adult without using drugs. I barely lived my life on a kind of human level. You know, I found having a shower and brushing my teeth every day a challenge.
And suddenly you have to care for another living being.
Yeah, exactly. And I had him for 3 years, and I dragged him around King's Cross, and I shot up behind his pram instead of in front of it. And I thought that was okay because he wasn't seeing what I was doing. But he was seeing me falling asleep on the train, and he never saw his father hit me, but I'm sure he would have heard my screams behind closed doors, you know. And when he was 3 years old, my mum came to take him, and I wasn't the best mum. And anyone who doesn't understand drug dependence would say I'm a terrible mother and I'm awful, and how could I do that?
No one's going to say that, my love. No one. I'm telling you now, no one's going to say that. And I'll tell you why no one's going to say that. Because even if you're not a drug addict, parenting is so freaking hard, man. You don't need to be on drugs to have the hardest time. It is the most challenging thing in the entire world. So the fact that nobody was willing to actually step up and say to you, you need to do these things when you're about to have a baby, whether you're addicted or not addicted, is a freaking crying shame.
And you know what? It's actually not something I'd thought about until saying it on this podcast today. I'd never thought about why weren't those services involved then?
Terrible.
Something more to fight for.
Yeah, that's the reason why I included that question. And I wanted to ask you about your experience and everything, even though I know it must be something that's very painful, because just reading the words from the article of your interview, I feel that, and I forwarded it to a few of my friends, because as I said to you, it took me a while to formulate questions for this podcast. And some of them actually came back quite judgmental in the way that, how could you choose this one thing? And it's not a job, it's not something, it's not your career, it's something that's bad or for your child. And I feel that when you say your story, the thing that really resonated with me was that you said that you barely even knew how to care and be responsible for yourself, let alone suddenly you have this boy to take care for.
But you know, it's interesting. I grew up in a violent home. And so, and the fear of violence is worse than the violence. I think when the violence comes, it's almost a relief. The threat, the constant threat of the fact that it's coming is terrifying. And when you live like that, and then you add on top of that a drug a drug addiction, and you probably didn't have much money, and you probably had little education, and you were surrounded by a whole lot of people who were your community, but the community was all involved in, it's almost like sharing the fat chocolate. I love to share a chocolate because I want the other person to be as fat as me at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think there's every single woman in the entire world knows about sharing the fat chocolate. So if you kind of extrapolate that out to sharing the drugs, you get a bit of an idea of kind of how you want everyone to sit inside your guilt. You want everyone to sit inside that. So I think, let's go down the path. I mean, to the point where you decided that, because you'd spend a lot of time at the methadone clinic in King's Cross. I mean, you were there every single day. You were shooting up every single day to try not to die, I guess, because that's why you go there, to try not to die. But then you got to a point where you thought you might die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was on methadone. I was getting my methadone at Kirkton Road Clinic, which is an amazing doctors and methadone clinic, and I was using.
Is that the safe space to inject? Is that the same?
Kirkton Road Clinic is where I used to pick up my methadone. So the injecting centre is United's medically supervised injecting centre. And I started accessing that. I think I was about 18 or 19 years old when it opened. And it's a very safe space to go and inject drug. They've actually, since that centre opened, they have had no overdoses there. The overdose rates in the community have dropped dramatically.
What does that mean? Because to some of our people who listen to this podcast, they may translate it as like a license to inject drug or a license to use drugs. So can you explain to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, and I'll go back to Natasha's other question after.
It's fine.
Sorry,
There's
Natasha.
so many questions.
There is, and I could speak all day on this stuff, honestly. So the medically supervised injecting centre is a very small space. It's a space that has 3 stages. You go in there and you put your name down and you tell them what drug you're going to use. The police aren't allowed to enter there and search you and arrest you for possession of drugs or for drug use. So you go in, you put your name down, you tell them what you're going to use, and you tell them how long since you've last used. So if you haven't used for a few weeks and you're about to use heroin, they can advise you when you get through to stage 2, which is where you get your clean injecting equipment and you sit at a little booth and you shoot up. They can, advise you around harm minimization approaches. So if you haven't used for a while, why don't you have half of the drugs first rather than taking them all? If something does happen and someone overdoses, they've got the appropriate medical equipment there to be able to reverse the overdose. So nobody has ever died there. I don't know how many thousands of visits, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of visits they've had from people using there, and they've never had anyone die. And in King's Cross and the Darlinghurst area, before the injecting centre opened, there were people dropping like flies. There were people overdosing all over the streets, in people's doorways, in gutters, overdosing and dying. The ambulance call-out rates, ambulance were having to attend to overdoses instead of heart attacks, So ambulance call-out rates have dropped. Dirty injecting equipment on the streets has dropped. There's so much benefit to the community, and then there's also the benefit to the people who use drugs, because you walk in there and the staff members are empathetic and they're compassionate and they're just really real with you, and they meet you where you're at. And that's one of the most, I work in community services, and that's one of the most important things in working with people who are going through challenges, is meeting them where they're at and addressing their needs in a way that works for them at the time. So I accessed that place for 8 years, almost every single day, sometimes 6 times a day, at the height of my using. And, I would go through to stage 3 and I would get to have conversations with staff members, and we could sit there and do crosswords or do colouring in. There was a phone if we wanted to call a detox or a rehab, and got on a waiting list for that. And there were people there to, if you were ready, to try and get support, to talk you through those conversations, So it's not just, I'll go in here and use drugs and get out there and kind of keep using. There's a very holistic approach to it, you know. They're there to support you to not die, but also there to support you in getting your needs met and, you know, helping you in your recovery journey if you get to that point.
Dr. Vincent?
I am just fascinated with that because I don't actually know that that's how it works, and the different stages and everything, and the fact that, because I never actually thought of the community impact, but if you can reduce the ambulance call out to people who are overdosing, those resources can be intended for people who with the medical issues. So you were telling us just now about the methadone clinic. So before I cut you off, so do you want to go and continue about the methadone clinic?
I wanted to, sorry, I'm going to jump in just for a second. It's about that community stuff. I lived in Caldwell Street in Darlinghurst, which you're probably familiar with. We used to get, well, it was a cul-de-sac with some stairs at the end. And so what would happen is often at 5 o'clock in the morning, the drug users would be out there, and often with their prams, often with their babies in the middle of winter. And they would be down there and they would shoot up. And we had a needle hotline, and the needle hotline would come and he would pick up the needles in the area. You know, I remember the first thing I taught my son was when you go outside, you may not pick anything up off the ground, because they were literally everywhere. And then I've always been in favor of legalizing drugs. I truly believe that legalizing drugs is one of the fastest ways to minimizing drug use, drug abuse, and also the impact on society. What do you feel about legalizing drugs, Liz?
So I just want to speak to both legalization and decriminalization, because Somebody's Child, which is I'm going to call it business organisation at the moment that I founded, and the Fair Treatment campaign, which is United's Fair Treatment campaign that I'm partnered with, aims to campaign for decriminalisation of drugs for personal use. So decriminalisation of possession of drugs for personal use, so not for dealing, and also decriminalisation of actually using substances, because it's a criminal offence to use a substance and to possess a substance. So legalisation, I would love that. And one day later down the track, I will campaign for that. Right now I'm campaigning for decriminalisation.
Yeah, I'm going to campaign with you. You call me. I'm going to come and fight for that. I truly think that is a
question.
Yes.
A question. No, I'm not for or against the decriminalization or the legalization of drugs. I can argue both from both points. However, it's interesting that you say that you would campaign, or you will campaign for the legalization of drugs, coming from a place that drug addiction have done a lot of damage. Some may be repairable, some probably are not. And having known that, if you know something that could be so dangerous, I just want to understand
why you would want
that to be legalized.
And I love that question, because I'm surrounded by a lot of people who are 100% with me. Why would I want to legalise? Because what we've done, criminalising drugs. Now, Richard Branson came to the launch of the Fair Treatment campaign, and what he said was, if the war on drugs was my business, it would have been shut down after the first year. It makes absolutely no sense. It does not minimise harms around drug use. It actually increases harm around drug use. There is so much shame and so much stigma placed on people who use drugs that it is harder for them to reach out and get support around their drug use. The fact that it is a criminal offence to use drugs means that people are criminalised. People who are medicating themselves, it's okay to use alcohol because that's legal. For some reason, alcohol's legal and that's all good and that's all okay. People who use illegal substances are criminalised. I'm a criminal. I'm a criminal because I had things that I medicated, and the most harm that I did was the harm that I did to myself. Now, if decriminalisation or legalisation happened and the money was taken out of punishment and put into treatment economically, For every $1 spent, $7 would be saved. So stop spending so much money on jails, stop spending so much money on police time, stop spending so much money on court time, and have that money go into treatment. It means that people have the chance to improve the quality of their life. You know, I went to a couple of residential treatment services, and it actually took me months each time to get into those services. Now, when decriminalisation happens, legalisation is a long way off as far as I'm concerned. So right now I'm like all about the decriminalisation. When decriminalisation happens, it means that, you know, instead of people being charged and going before a court and facing potential jail time, they will go to a panel who will sit down and have a conversation about what is the appropriate form of treatment, you know, and looking at a holistic approach, you know, what's appropriate for this person, having those things available for them, you know, as soon as they need them, because right now people are dying. You know, the rehabs have these like Excel spreadsheets set up with people's names on them and marking them off when they ring up every day or they ring up every week, and they're dying while their name sits on an Excel spreadsheet.
Dying to get in. Dying to get in.
Literally dying. And if they committed a petty crime in relation to their drug use, there's a chance that they'll end up in jail at, you know, much higher cost to the taxpayers. And there's no, from what I understand, there is actually no negative to decriminalisation. When you look at countries like Portugal and a few other countries who have decriminalised drugs and put in appropriate treatment, their drug use rate has decreased. Their drug dependency rate has decreased. Their
so
overdose
decriminalization
rate,
for people who use it, not for people who deal it.
However,
the product or the illegal substance was obtained illegally. So at some point there was an illegal and criminal activity that happened. So that's where I sort of kind of stopped short of wanting that. I do agree with you that we need to pour more resources and attract more attention towards recovery. However, in Australia, we also have a lot of intent. So if you're intending, or if your intent is to use the illegal substance, so that's where the argument becomes a little bit muddy.
Yeah. So the decriminalisation that Somebody's Child supports and that the Fair Treatment Campaign supports is decriminalisation of possession for personal use. So it will be on different drugs, it will be different quantities. So for marijuana, it might be, I'm not sure what they're going to consider personal use, whether it's 3 grams or 7 grams or what they're going to, I don't know the ins and outs of how that would look, and that would be big and lengthy discussions around that. And decriminalisation of actually using drugs. Now, if someone is selling drugs, if someone is a drug dealer, that's a completely different offence to someone who is in possession of for personal use. Someone who is, and I have actually been charged with supply of drugs. Now, extremely small amounts and only to fund my use. And it was actually rock salt that I sold to an undercover police officer. It wasn't even real stuff. But I have a supply charge in my list of criminal offences. And look, I don't believe that should be decriminalised. I do not believe at all that drug dealing should be decriminalised. I'm 100% against drug dealing.
And I think what's remarkable about you, Liz, is that you have survived. Not only have you got out of what is a shocking way of life, abusive way of life, but you've actually got to the point where you are now sitting on our podcast and you are telling the world about, the fact that you recovered. You have 2 children, you are in a stable relationship, you are healthy. I mean, I saw photographs of you when you were a drug addict, and you have that typical drug addict look, the drawn face, the tracksuit pants, the greasy hair in a ponytail. It's literally a look that you can see everywhere. I mean, it's almost, so you're now this beautiful, amazing woman. I mean, you always probably were that, but how did you find her? How did you find that beautiful woman?
I went through a lot of work, and I'm still finding her. I At 25 years old, I had a moment in my using where I went, I'm going to die. I'm going to die a junkie whore in a gutter, and I don't want that. Straight out. That was what I thought of myself. That's what society told me I was. And I rang my mum and told her I'm coming home, and she left the door open for me when she went to work. And I went back to my mum's, and my son was living there with her. He ended up living with my mother for 5 years in total. And she told me I had to get off methadone. And I stood in the kitchen and laughed at her and told her, people don't get off methadone. And she just said to me, most people don't use methadone. My mum just does not get drug dependence, Most people don't use methadone. And I didn't want to get off methadone because I didn't know it was possible, and I slowly reduced off my methadone, and I sat for months on a waiting list to get into a treatment service. And I went to Jarrah House, which is a women and children's service, and then I went on to do Kathleen York House, which is another women and children's service. And, I went into that first program with no hope. I thought, all right, I'm going to come off methadone. I'll do the payday using, I'll smoke pot, and I'll get a house and I'll get my son back and everything will be okay. And what I realised when I got there was actually it doesn't work like that. It's not that easy, and I can't use anymore. I went to meetings of 12-step fellowships while in that treatment service, and I got hope for the first time in my life, or for the first time in a long time. I got this little bit of hope. There were people who came in there who had used the way that I'd used, and they spoke about not using, and they spoke about their lives being changed dramatically, the quality of their lives being improved. They spoke about getting their children back, and they spoke about having jobs, and they spoke about feeling good about themselves, and I sat there and I looked at these women, and, a couple of them I knew, a couple of them that I'd used with, they'd done the things that I'd done. And I walked out of there, my intention was to, go and have a shot of Coke when I left, and, go back to my mum's and be okay. And, when I left, I called my mum and desperately asked her, can you pick me up? Because I was so scared of using, because I was so scared if I go and use, well, I'm just going to go back to what I was doing before, and I've got no hope then, And so I'm still a member of the 12-step fellowship. I, don't do as many meetings as I used to do, but I am 100% still a member, and I connect with people in recovery. And I built a really strong foundation in my recovery. I did over 20 months of rehab program. I prayed and I meditated and I reached out to people and I connected with people and I cried, and I wanted to use almost every day, probably for the first 6 to 12 months of my recovery. I'd never lived without using drugs. So for 10 years, I had used drugs every single day. And so I found it extremely difficult right at the start, but I got through one day at a time. I just didn't use, and, now at a point where I'm over 10 years in recovery and I don't think of using anymore. Life on life's terms is sometimes really hard. I've had lots of challenges over the last 10 years, but I've got through them without the need to use, because I've learned to do other things. I've learned to reach out and connect. And Johann Hari speaks about the opposite to addiction being connection. And I really strongly resonate with that. One day I'm going to interview him. I really strongly resonate with that, because my addiction was all about disconnection. It was disconnecting from myself and disconnecting from my family and disconnecting from society. And my recovery has been all about connection and purpose. It's reconnecting with myself and reconnecting with my family. And, my son, who I've, came back to live with me when he was 8 years old, and, he's now 16 and has a child of his own, and, gets to do things really different, although that wasn't in my kind of vision. He gets to do things really different to how I do, and I get to be there to support him, and that's only possible.
He's not driven towards taking drugs. There's nothing in him that wants that kind of life or needs the salve.
He's a teenager who has experimented. I hope he's okay with me saying that. He's a teenager who has experimented, but I have no concerns at this point in time around drug dependence with him in any way. He is a child who has a lot of loyalty towards his partner and his daughter, and I look at the way he looks at her and he loves her, and I know more than anything in the world he wants to protect that little girl, and I think a lot of that, comes from that, natural instinct of being a parent, but that he also missed out on so much with me and his dad, that he knows he needs to give something more, and that I think that really drives him in the amazing parent that at 16 years old, I see him being,
I think society actually makes recovery, I think, harder for people like you. And look at you now talking about that, inspiring people and having your own organization to champion certain causes and everything. If people look at you and look at your story and everything, I think people would change the perception in terms of addiction and recovery. But why do you think people have such a strong negative bias towards former drug user? Or do you feel that people have that against you?
So my experience, I've been sharing my story publicly on many different media platforms for over 5 years now. And I would say I've had tens of thousands of people, potentially, I guess over time, over 100,000 people more view my story in, one different format or another. And I, could count on two hands the number of negative kind of comments that I've had made about me that I've been aware of. So most people are actually inspired and touched, and there's so much positivity kind of thrown on me about me sharing my story. And I had a lot of fear at the start. When I did that, I might get negative comments. And because my experience is most people, and I know thousands of people in recovery, like literally thousands of people in this country who are teachers and doctors and lawyers and your next door neighbours and your work colleagues, and they don't speak openly about it due to the stigma, because they think, if I speak openly about this, well, I'm not going to get that job, or that the other parents at the school aren't going to let my kids come and play at their house, or their kids aren't going to be allowed to come and play at my house. There's so much fear around that, and I actually think that helps to fuel the stigma. I think that, people in recovery hiding that stuff fuels the stigma, because, there's that thing, and, once a junkie, always a junkie. And the reality is, that term is so stigmatizing, but the reality is it's not actually the truth. Because, I used to shoot up in gutters. I was at the absolute extreme end of drug use. And I now work with people, supporting them in their recoveries or supporting them in minimizing harm around their drug use. And, so if someone ever says to me, they're always going to be a junkie, like, no, they're not. And by society saying that, it keeps them in that box, and it keeps them believing that recovery isn't possible. And I never knew, until I went to a rehab where people told me recovery was possible, I never knew that it was. And what a sad state of,
hopelessness.
Yeah, and just that thing that, I speak openly about recovery because most people I know don't. And because most people don't, most people who need to hear about it never get the chance to do so, and they die without ever actually getting that hope.
I think, I'm going to close the interview now, but it's an interesting thing. I'm dealing with a 15-year-old at school in year 10, and I'm dealing with the drugs at the moment. I've recently looked after a friend's child for almost a year that got expelled for dealing drugs at a very posh Eastern Suburbs school. and was sent down to me. And I have to say that the journey, I loved him. He had the most beautiful personality, has the most beautiful personality, but just could not pull himself from that way of life. And what frustrated me the most is that, you know, in Bondi Junction, there is a drug dealer that all the kids know, and they know where he is, and they go up to get their drugs. And he knows that he is dealing to 14-year-olds. The child was 14 when he came to me. You know, and this is the tragedy. The tragedy is that you start with the soft brain, and the boys have got the soft brains particularly, and it just kind of grows from there. I'm so grateful for you coming on. I'm so grateful that you have shared your beautiful story. I'm so incredibly impressed and proud that you have stepped your way out of your horror and into something that is really light and beautiful. And let me tell you, life doesn't matter whether you're doing drugs or not doing drugs. It's a shit show. You know, we do this podcast to try to show people how freaking hard it is, man. You know, if you're not dealing with one issue, you're dealing with bullying. If you're not dealing with bullying, it's trauma. If you're not dealing with trauma, it's drugs. You know, the only one that we've ever done, the only interview we've ever done, which is about stepping into the light, is the one on meditation. And I think that is actually where the hope for everyone is to move towards the consciousness, to move towards the collective, to move towards the community. And as you say, disconnection breaks you. So my recommendation for everyone is to go and sign up for Andy Amos's meditation course, which is one of the other videos we've done, so that you can connect and stay strong. And Liz, I just want to say thank you so much. You've just been so honest, and it's been so beautiful to interview you. I felt so touched. Thank you.
No,
and thank you for giving face to hope and face to recovery and everything, because sometimes for us, most people, it's very hard to just read the story or the cases and news, but to actually see someone, in this case yourself, speaking the truth and putting face on recovery, drug recovery. I think, thank you so much for coming on to our podcast.
Thank you. Thank you both very much.
That's a pleasure. The last thing I want to do is, obviously somebody's child has somewhere for people to go and see what you're doing. Is there a website or Instagram page? Can you give us some websites and things that people...
The website is a work in progress. So it's somebodieschild.com.au. Is it .com or .com.au? It's one of the two. It is a work in progress though, but Facebook is where I do most of my stuff, and it's just Somebody's Child. And yeah, go on, like the page. We are supporting Dubbo Needs a Rehab at the moment, because Dubbo doesn't have a rehab. There's not enough rehabs in Western New South Wales. So, you know, head over, follow Somebody's Child. And
is there anywhere else that people who are struggling could get hold of? Is there somewhere that is a universal that you highly recommend?
Look, for people struggling with drug dependence, I recommend checking out the Narcotics Anonymous website. I'm also going to things like family drug support. But yeah, if it's for your own personal drug use, Narcotics Anonymous is something that I very highly recommend.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. We'll put that up. Thank you, Dr. Vincent. Your questions are always incredible and never the ones that I would ever think to ask. Liz, you're amazing. And you've been listening to the Living Out Loud podcast with Natasha Moy and Dr. Vincent. We have been interviewing Liz Gall, who is in recovery and will remain in recovery from drug addiction, hopefully for the very rest of her beautiful life. If you'd like to watch any other fantastic videos, we've got a YouTube channel, Living Out Loud, or you can follow our podcast channel, Living Out Loud. It's .com.au. So thank you very much, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.